Panic tastes like copper. It coats the back of your throat, thick and metallic, right before your lungs forget how to work. She only needed a quiet exit. Instead, she tore through the restricted corridor of the Azure Hotel with a bruised wrist and a broken heel, her ex-boyfriend's heavy footsteps echoing right behind her. She slammed her hand against the elevator button. The doors parted. She threw herself inside, completely unaware she had just stepped into a cage with the city's most ruthless predator. The ballroom smelled of expensive gardenias and cheap hypocrisy. Nora kept her eyes fixed on the tray of champagne flutes in her hands, navigating the sea of silk dresses and tailored tuxedos. She was working. That was the only thing keeping her grounded. If she kept moving, kept serving, kept fading into the opulent background of the charity gala, she wouldn't have to think about the eviction notice on her kitchen counter, or the bruises fading on her collarbone. Then she saw him. Trent was leaning against the mahogany bar, swirling an amber drink in a crystal glass. He didn't belong here. He didn't have the money for a ticket, and he certainly didn't possess the grace to blend in with the old money of the city. He wore a suit that was a shade too shiny, his jaw tight, his eyes scanning the room with that familiar, restless aggression. Nora stopped. The breath vanished from her lungs. A flute wobbled on her tray, the champagne spilling over the rim to sting a small paper cut on her thumb. He was looking for her. She turned sharply, her sensible black uniform flats squeaking slightly against the polished marble floor. She needed to reach the kitchen. Once behind the swinging metal doors, she could find the service exit, slip into the alley, and disappear into the biting November rain. Nora, the voice cut through the hum of a jazz quartet and the clinking of crystal. It wasn't loud, but it carried a frequency designed to paralyze her. A dog whistle for her specific trauma. She walked faster, her heart slammed against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Don't look back. A hand clamped down on her bicep. Fingers dug into muscle, finding the exact spot that was still tender from 3 weeks ago. Trent yanked her backward. The tray slipped. Champagne glasses shattered against the marble, a discordant crash that turned a dozen wealthy heads. "I've been calling you," Trent hissed, leaning in close. He smelled like spearmint gum and stale gin. "You blocked my number." "Let go of me, Trent," Nora whispered, keeping her voice level. Panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. Hysterics would only feed him. "I'm working." "You're making a scene," he said, his grip tightening. He offered a tight, artificial smile to a passing couple who had paused to stare. "She's just a little clumsy. We're fine." The couple moved on, their eyes averted. People always looked away. It was the great tragedy of a civilized society. Nobody wanted to interrupt a private domestic nightmare. "I said, let go." Nora tried to pull her arm back. Pain flared hot and bright in her shoulder. "We need to talk. You think you can just pack your bags while I'm at work and ghost me after everything I did for you?" His voice dropped, losing the artificial sweetness. The mask was slipping. The vein at his temple began to throb. "You're coming with me." He pulled her toward the cloakroom corridor. It was darker there, away from the glittering chandeliers and the judgmental eyes of the socialites. Nora dug her heels into the carpet. She knew what happened when they got to the dark places. The apologies, the promises, the closed fists. She wasn't going back, not this time. With a sudden, violent twist, Nora threw her weight to the side, driving the sharp point of her elbow directly into Trent's ribs. He grunted, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. It was all she needed. She ripped her arm free and ran. She didn't head for the kitchen. He would expect that. Instead, she sprinted down the private VIP corridor, tearing past a velvet rope. The hallway was hushed, lined with heavy, soundproof doors and thick Persian rugs that swallowed the sound of her frantic footsteps. "Nora!" The roar echoed off the walls. The sheer rage in it sent a fresh spike of adrenaline through her veins. She glanced over her shoulder. Trent had recovered. He was running after her, his face twisted in a snarl, discarding any pretense of civility. Nora pushed herself harder. Her lungs burned. Her left shoe caught the edge of the rug, twisting her ankle with a sharp crack of pain. But she didn't fall. She kicked the flats off entirely, her stockinged feet sliding on the polished floorboards at the end of the rug. At the end of the corridor, a set of brushed steel elevator doors stood closed. Above them, a small digital display glowed red. The VIP express lift. She slammed her palm against the call button, hitting it over and over. Please, please, please. Behind her, Trent was closing the distance. 30 feet, 20 feet. She could hear the heavy thud of his dress shoes, the ragged sound of his breathing. The elevator pinged. The steel doors slid apart with a soft, expensive whisper. Nora didn't wait for them to open fully. She threw herself through the narrow gap, stumbling into the cabin. She hit the back wall hard, her shoulder taking the brunt of the impact, gasping for air. "Close!" she sobbed, scrambling to hit the control panel. But someone was already standing there. The air inside the elevator was 10 degrees colder than the hallway. It didn't smell like gardenias. It smelled like ozone, rain-soaked wool, and something darker. Iron. Nora froze, her hand hovering inches from the control panel. There were 2 men inside. The man nearest the buttons was built like a cinder block wall. He wore a dark, tailored suit that failed to hide the thick, corded muscle of his chest and arms. His hands were clasped in front of him, thick fingers resting against his knuckles. He didn't look at her. He didn't even flinch when she slammed into the wall. The second man stood in the center of the car. Nora's breath hitched. She had spent years reading the body language of dangerous men, learning to map the geography of a room to find the safest corner. The man standing before her didn't radiate the loud, chaotic violence that Trent did. He radiated absolute, terrifying stillness. He was tall, dressed in a charcoal 3-piece suit that fit with a precision that bordered on lethal. His dark hair was swept back, touched with silver at the temples, but it was his eyes that pinned her to the spot. They were a pale, fractured gray, the color of winter concrete. They held no surprise, no pity, and no warmth. Roman Coyle. Nora recognized him from the whispers in the hotel break room, the hushed conversations between the valet staff. He wasn't a celebrity, but he owned half the real estate in the city and controlled the unlit corners of the other half. He was a man who moved money and destroyed lives with a single signature. "Nora!" Trent's voice was right outside. Panic snapped her out of her stupor. She lunged for the closed door button, but the large man, the bodyguard, stepped in her way, blocking the panel with his massive frame. Through the closing gap of the doors, Trent appeared. His face was red, sweating, his eyes wild. He saw her. He threw his hand out, his fingers wrapping around the edge of the brushed steel door, trying to force it back open. The safety sensors didn't trigger. Trent's face contorted as he tried to pry the doors apart. "Get out here, you stupid bitch!" he screamed, his spittle flying against the metal. Nora backed up against the mirrored wall, her hands trembling, pulling her knees tight. She waited for Trent to force his way in. She waited for the inevitable. Roman Coyle didn't move his head. He merely shifted his pale eyes toward the bodyguard. A fractional nod. The bodyguard reached out, unhurried, and pressed a single button on a separate, key-operated panel. The elevator motors groaned. The doors, instead of retracting from Trent's obstruction, continued to close with an overwhelming hydraulic force. Trent yelped, the metal crushing his fingers. He yanked his hand back just before the door sealed completely shut. Silence descended on the cabin. A heavy, suffocating silence, broken only by the soft hum of the elevator descending. Nora slid down the mirrored wall, her legs giving out. She hit the floor, her chest heaving, staring at the brushed steel doors where Trent's fingers had been a second ago. She was safe from the hallway, but she was trapped in a descending box with the devil. She looked up. Roman was looking down at her. He didn't offer a hand. He didn't ask if she was all right. He simply observed her, the way a scientist might observe a bruised moth fluttering in a jar. He took in her torn uniform, the missing shoes, the red marks blooming on her pale arm where Trent had grabbed her. "My apologies," Nora choked out, her voice raspy. She forced herself to stand, her ankle throbbing. "You didn't show weakness to men like this. You stood up." "I took a wrong turn. I'll get off at the lobby." "The lobby is restricted," Roman said. His voice was a low baritone, smooth and completely devoid of inflection. It didn't bounce off the walls. It seemed to absorb the air in the room. "This car goes to the private garage." "The garage is fine," Nora said quickly. She smoothed down her skirt with shaking hands, trying to summon some shred of professional dignity. "I'll exit there. Thank you for the doors." Roman pulled a silver case from his inside pocket, snapping it open with his thumb. He withdrew a cigarette, though he didn't light it, merely rolling it between his long, clean fingers. "The man in the hall," Roman said quietly. "A debt collector?" "An ex," Nora said. She didn't want to elaborate. Giving details was giving ammunition. "He lacks discipline," Roman noted, as if critiquing a poorly trained dog. "He lacks a lot of things," Nora muttered bitterly, the cynicism overriding her fear for a brief second. "Mostly impulse control and a basic understanding of the word no." The bodyguard snorted softly. Roman's gaze remained fixed on Nora. "You're bleeding," he said. Nora looked down. The paper cut on her thumb had reopened, a thin line of crimson tracing down her palm from the broken champagne glass. It was a tiny wound, insignificant compared to the ache in her shoulder and ankle. But seeing the blood made the reality of the last 5 minutes crash down on her. She reached into her apron pocket, hands trembling violently now that the immediate threat was gone, pulling out a crumpled paper napkin to press against her hand. "It's nothing," she said, staring at the numbers ticking down on the display. 14, 13, 12. "Just a scratch. People rarely run out of their shoes for a scratch." Nora snapped her head up, meeting his pale eyes. They were cold, yes, but they weren't cruel. There was a clinical curiosity there. "I ran because if he cornered me, a scratch would be the best-case scenario," Nora said, her tone hardening. She was exhausted. She was broke, terrified, and cornered. She didn't have the energy to play coy with a mob boss. "I'm sure a man in your line of work understands the physics of a threat." Roman stopped rolling the cigarette. He tilted his head, a microscopic shift. "I understand the physics of power," Roman corrected softly. "He believed he had it over you. You proved him wrong." "For tonight," Nora murmured, looking away. 5, 4, 3. "Tomorrow is a different story," the elevator chimed. The display read, G. "We are here, Mr. Coyle," the bodyguard said, stepping back from the panel. The steel doors slid open, revealing the cavernous, dimly lit expanse of the hotel's underground VIP parking garage. The air smelled of exhaust, damp concrete, and old oil. A sleek, black-armored sedan sat idling a few yards away, its headlights cutting through the gloom. Nora stepped forward, favoring her uninjured foot. "Thank you again," she said to the floor, eager to escape the suffocating presence of the two men. "I'll find my own way up." She limped out of the elevator into the cold garage. She needed to find the exit ramp. If she kept to the shadows, she could make it to the street, hail a cab. Wait, she had no money. She'd walk. She'd walk until her feet bled, as long as it was away from the hotel. "Nora!" The voice didn't come from the elevator behind her. It came from the shadows to her left. Nora froze. Her blood turned to ice water. Trent stepped out from behind a concrete pillar. He was breathing heavily, his suit jacket discarded, his shirt unbuttoned at the collar. He had taken the service stairs, 14 flights, fueled entirely by rage. His right hand was cradled against his chest, 2 fingers swelling and purple from where the elevator doors had crushed them. "You really thought a box was going to save you?" Trent spat, his face contorted in a sneer. He took a step toward her. The space was wide open. There were no doors to lock, no crowds to hide behind. Nora backed up, hitting the cold steel frame of the elevator doors. She was trapped. "Trent, don't do this," Nora warned, her voice trembling despite her best efforts. "There are cameras down here." "I don't care about cameras," he shouted, closing the distance. "You humiliated me. You made me look like a fool up there. You think you're better than me? You're nothing without me." He reached for her. Nora threw her hands up to protect her face, bracing for the impact. The impact never came. Instead, a blur of dark fabric moved past her. The bodyguard. He moved with a terrifying, fluid speed that defied his massive bulk. Before Trent's hand could even graze Nora, the bodyguard grabbed Trent by the throat and slammed him against the concrete pillar. The sound was sickening. A heavy, meaty thud of bone against stone. All the air left Trent's lungs in a violent whoosh. His feet dangled an inch off the ground, his face instantly purpling as the bodyguard's thick fingers crushed his windpipe. Nora gasped, pressing a hand to her mouth. Trent thrashed, clawing at the giant's arm, his eyes bulging with genuine terror. The swagger, the loud anger, the abusive confidence, it all evaporated the second he met true, unfiltered violence. He was a bully who had just picked a fight with a monster. Roman stepped out of the elevator. His footsteps were silent on the concrete. He didn't look at Trent. He didn't even acknowledge the man choking to death against the pillar. Roman walked past the struggle, moving toward the idling black sedan. He stopped by the open back door, resting his hand on the roof. He finally turned his head, his pale gray eyes finding Nora, who was standing paralyzed against the elevator. "There are 2 ways this night ends for you," Roman said. His voice echoed slightly in the vast garage, calm and utterly detached. "You can walk up that ramp. He will heal. He will find you again. And eventually, he will kill you. Men like him always do. It is in their nature." Nora couldn't tear her eyes away from Trent, who was beginning to lose consciousness, his legs kicking weakly. "Or Roman continued, his tone shifting into something marginally darker. You get in the car. Nora looked at him, at the tailored suit, the cold eyes, the idling armored car. She was trading one nightmare for another. Trent was a known variable. He was a pathetic, angry man with a fragile ego. Roman Coyle was an abyss. If she got in that car, she belonged to the underworld. She belonged to him. Why? Nora whispered, her voice cracking. Why would you help me? Roman's gaze drifted to Trent, then back to her. A muscle ticked in his jaw. I despise noise, Roman said simply, and I abhor men who squander their power on the defenseless. He opened the door a fraction wider. Decide, Nora. My patience is not infinite. Nora looked at the exit ramp, a steep, dark climb back into a world that had offered her nothing but unpaid bills and black eyes. Then she looked at the heavy leather interior of the black sedan. Safety. But at what cost? The bodyguard loosened his grip slightly. Trent gasped, a pathetic wheezing sound, his eyes rolling back. Nora made her choice. She pushed away from the elevator and limped across the cold concrete. She didn't look at Trent as she passed him. She didn't look at the bodyguard. She walked straight to the open door of the sedan and slid into the quiet, dark interior. It smelled of rich leather and that same terrifying scent of ozone. Roman closed the door behind her with a solid, heavy thud. The lock engaged. There was no turning back now. The heavy door closed, severing the harsh acoustics of the concrete garage. Inside the sedan, the silence was absolute. It was a thick, engineered quiet, the kind that cost millions of dollars and swallowed sound whole. Nora sank into the leather. It was absurdly soft, a stark contrast to the rigid, trembling tension in her spine. She stared straight ahead through the tinted partition, refusing to look at the space beside her. She could feel him there. Roman Coyle didn't take up much physical space. He sat perfectly still, his posture impeccable. But his presence possessed a gravitational pull. It sucked the oxygen from the cabin. The driver's side door opened. The massive bodyguard folded himself behind the wheel. He smelled faintly of rain and exertion. He didn't say a word. He didn't even adjust the rear-view mirror before throwing the heavy armored car into drive. The tires let out a muted squeal against the polished concrete as they ascended the ramp. They breached the surface, merging instantly into the slick, rain-swept streets of the city. Neon lights bled across the wet glass. Nora watched the blurred streaks of red and yellow. The adrenaline was finally beginning to recede, leaving behind a cold, hollow ache. Her left ankle throbbed with a dull, rhythmic intensity. Her shoulder burned, but worst of all was the stinging in her right hand. She uncurled her fist. The paper napkin she had shoved against the cut was soaked through, the cheap paper disintegrating into a bloody pulp against her palm. A flash of white caught her peripheral vision. Roman was holding out a square of immaculate linen. He didn't look at her. His gaze was fixed on the passing city, his profile sharp and illuminated by the passing streetlights. Nora hesitated. Taking something from a man like him felt like signing a contract in invisible ink. But the blood was threatening to drip onto the bespoke upholstery. She reached out, her fingers trembling, and took the handkerchief. "Thank you," she rasped. Her voice sounded thin, pathetic. "Press firmly," Roman said. His tone was a flat, unreadable bass line. "Gideon will call ahead. A doctor will be waiting." "I don't need a doctor." The lie was automatic. Poverty had taught her that doctors were a luxury. A hospital meant questions. Questions meant police. Police meant Trent finding her again, crying in a precinct waiting room, convincing the desk sergeant that she was just hysterical and off her medication. "You are shaking," Roman observed coldly. "Your ankle is bearing 0 weight, and you are bleeding on my seats. You need a doctor." He didn't phrase it as a suggestion. It was a geographic fact, as undeniable as gravity. Nora bit the inside of her cheek and pressed the heavy linen to her hand. The fabric smelled faintly of cedar and expensive unscented soap. She closed her eyes, letting the rhythmic thrum of the engine vibrate through the floorboards. She had jumped from a burning building into a dark ocean. She wasn't burning anymore, but she was entirely adrift. 20 minutes later, the sedan descended into another subterranean garage. This one was cleaner, brighter, and entirely empty, save for a row of high-end, unmarked vehicles. Gideon parked the car smoothly. He stepped out, opening Nora's door before she could even reach for the handle. She swung her legs out. When her injured foot touched the concrete, a sharp spike of pain shot up to her knee. She hissed, her knees buckling. Before she could hit the ground, a hand caught her under the elbow. It was Roman. His grip was entirely different from Trent's. Trent grabbed to hurt, to control, to bruise. Roman's hold was mechanical, a vice designed solely to bear weight. He didn't pull her close. He merely arrested her fall, holding her upright with a terrifying, effortless strength. "Walk on the right leg," Roman instructed, his face a mask of stone. "Gideon will clear the path." Nora nodded, too exhausted to protest. She hobbled toward a private elevator bank, leaning heavily away from Roman's grip, though he never let her slip. The elevator didn't have numbers. It only had a key card scanner. Roman swiped a sleek black card, and the car shot upward with stomach-dropping speed. When the doors parted, they didn't open into a hallway. They opened directly into a fortress. It was a penthouse, but it possessed none of the gaudy, gold-leafed opulence she expected from a crime boss. It was brutalist and vast. Exposed concrete ceilings, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the sprawling, glittering grid of the city, and furniture composed of dark leather and sharp steel angles. It looked less like a home and more like a high-altitude bunker. There were no photographs, no books, no signs of human attachment. A man in a wrinkled dress shirt and a loosened tie was waiting by a massive kitchen island. He held a black medical bag. "Sit her down, Roman," the man said, moving forward. He didn't sound intimidated. He sounded tired. Roman guided Nora to a low leather sofa. As soon as she was seated, he released her arm and took a step back, instantly re-establishing the physical distance between them. "Dr. Hales will assess the damage," Roman said, adjusting his cuffs. He looked down at her, his pale eyes entirely unreadable. "Do not lie to him. It wastes my time." Without waiting for a response, Roman turned and walked down a long, shadowed hallway, the heavy thud of his shoes fading into the cavernous silence of the apartment. Nora watched him go, clutching the bloody handkerchief. She was alone with two strangers in a sky-high prison. The cynical part of her brain, the part that had kept her alive for the past 3 years, finally kicked into gear. Assess, adapt, survive. She looked at Dr. Hales. "Let's get this over with," she said. Dr. Hales was efficient and utterly devoid of bedside manner. Nora appreciated that. She didn't want pity. "Clean slice on the hand. Needs glue, not stitches," Hales muttered, inspecting her palm under the harsh glare of a penlight. "The shoulder is a deep tissue contusion. Ice and ibuprofen. The ankle is a grade 2 sprain. You're lucky nothing snapped." "I have thick bones," Nora said dryly. Hale shot her a look, half amused, half tired. He wrapped her ankle in a tight, stabilizing brace. "Keep the weight off it for 48 hours. I'll leave painkillers with Gideon." He packed up his bag, snapping the latch shut. "You look like you haven't slept a full night in a month. I suggest you start now." He walked out, the private elevator swallowing him whole. Nora was left alone in the massive, echoing living room. The silence was deafening. She gingerly touched the medical glue on her palm, the sharp sting grounding her in reality. She needed to figure out the rules of this place. Abusive men always had rules. Trent's rules shifted depending on his mood and his alcohol intake. What were Roman Coyle's rules? A middle-aged woman appeared from a side corridor. She wore dark slacks and a simple gray sweater. Her face was kind, but her eyes held a sharp, calculating intelligence. "I am Martha," the woman said, stopping a respectful distance away. "Mr. Coyle requested I show you to the guest quarters. I have laid out clean clothing. Yours are ruined." Nora looked down at her torn, champagne-stained uniform. "Thank you." Martha helped her stand. The walk down the hallway was slow. The guest room was a continuation of the apartment's aesthetic. Stark, clean, expensive. A massive bed dominated the space, covered in heavy gray linens. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a dizzying view of the city streets, far below. On the foot of the bed sat a pile of neatly folded clothes, sweatpants, a soft cotton t-shirt, and thick socks. None of it looked like it belonged to Roman. It looked new. "The bathroom is through there," Martha pointed. "Take your time. No one will disturb you here." "Martha," Nora said, stopping the woman before she could leave. "Am I a prisoner?" Martha paused in the doorway. She didn't smile, but her expression softened marginally. "The elevator requires a code to descend. You do not have it. So yes, Mr. Coyle is a careful man," Martha replied smoothly. "You were involved in an incident in his hotel. Until he determines how to handle the loose ends, he prefers to keep his variables contained. Rest, miss. You are safer here than you were on the street." The door clicked shut. Nora showered with military speed, terrified of being vulnerable, keeping her injured foot wrapped in a plastic bag she found under the sink. The hot water stripped away the smell of the hotel, the smell of fear, but it couldn't wash away the bone-deep exhaustion. She dressed in the borrowed clothes. They were slightly too big, making her feel even smaller than she was. She limped to the window and pressed her forehead against the cool glass. Down there, Trent was likely at a hospital, nursing a crushed hand and a bruised throat. He would be furious. He would be tearing their small apartment apart, looking for clues, looking for a way to punish her. But up here, above the clouds, the city looked small, harmless. She slept for 12 hours. When she woke, the sky outside was the color of bruised iron. Rain lashed against the thick glass. Nora sat up, her ankle protesting fiercely. The pain was sharper today, a brutal reminder that last night wasn't a nightmare. She made her way out of the bedroom, leaning heavily on the walls. The apartment was deathly quiet. She found the kitchen, a massive expanse of black marble and stainless steel. A pot of coffee sat on the counter, still warm. She poured a mug, wrapping her hands around the ceramic to leach the heat. "You should be elevating that leg." Nora spun around, nearly dropping the mug. Roman was sitting at a massive dining table at the far end of the room, completely shadowed by the lack of overhead lighting. He had a laptop open, the blue light reflecting in his pale eyes. He wore a simple black turtleneck and dark trousers, looking less like a mob boss and more like a predatory academic. Nora steadied her breathing and limped toward him, stopping a few feet away from the table. "I prefer to be upright," she said. Roman closed the laptop. The quiet snap echoed in the large room. He leaned back in his chair, studying her. It was the same clinical observation from the elevator. He was stripping her down to her components, figuring out how she worked. "Trenton Miller," Roman said flatly. Nora flinched. Hearing Trent's full name in this sterile environment felt like a violation. "You ran a background check." "I run checks on anyone who bleeds in my vehicles," Roman replied. He is a mid-level shift manager at a logistics firm. He has 3 citations for public intoxication and a concerning amount of debt. A deeply unremarkable man, prone to loud, pathetic violence. Nora gripped the mug tighter. "He's not your problem anymore. He made himself my problem the moment he caused a disturbance in my hotel," Roman corrected smoothly. "I do not tolerate disorder, Nora. He created disorder. My men handled it." "So what happens now?" Nora asked, her voice tight. "You have me locked in your tower. Are you holding me for ransom? Because Trent doesn't have a dime, and I have exactly $42 in a checking account." Roman didn't smile. He simply blinked, a slow, deliberate movement. "I do not trade in human currency," Roman said, his voice dropping a fraction of an octave. "I brought you here because letting you walk out of that garage would have resulted in your death. I abhor waste. The code for the elevator is 0419. You are free to leave whenever you wish." Nora stared at him, the breath caught in her throat. "I can just leave?" "You are not a hostage." "Then why did you bring me here? Why the code? Why the doctor?" "Because," Roman said, leaning forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table, "I wanted to offer you a choice. You can walk out those doors. You can return to your life. Trenton Miller will find you, and you will spend the rest of your days looking over your shoulder until he finally catches you." He let the silence hang, heavy and suffocating. "Or," Roman continued softly, "you can stay. You have nowhere to go. You have no resources. I have an excess of both. You will remain here, out of sight, until I am satisfied that Mr. Miller is no longer a variable that requires my attention." Nora narrowed her eyes, the cynical survivor pushing past the fear. "Nothing is free, especially not from a man like you. What's the catch?" "You owe me a debt," Roman stated plainly. "My men saved your life. My doctor fixed your injuries. I require repayment." "I told you, I don't have money. I don't want your money." Roman's gaze was unyielding. "I require order. My operation relies on silence, discretion, and meticulous organization. I have a backlog of physical ledgers that cannot be digitized. They need to be audited and filed. It is tedious, secure work. You will do it." Nora blinked. "You want me to do your paperwork?" "I want someone who has a vested interest in remaining invisible," Roman corrected. "You know how to survive. You know how to keep your head down. I am offering you sanctuary in exchange for your labor. It is a transaction, nothing more." He wasn't looking at her with lust or pity or cruelty. He was looking at her like a tool that perfectly fit a specific problem. It was cold. It was calculating, and it was exactly what Nora needed. No emotional strings, just survival. She took a slow sip of the black coffee. It was bitter, strong, and burned all the way down. "Where are the ledgers?" she asked. 5 days bled into one another. The penthouse existed in a state of perpetual twilight, suspended high above the noise of the city. Nora adapted with the frightening speed of someone who had spent years walking on eggshells. She mapped the territory. She learned that Gideon arrived at 6 a.m. sharp, that Martha preferred the kitchen spotless, and that Roman Coyle was a ghost in his own home. He was there, but he occupied the space with zero friction. He rarely spoke above a murmur. He didn't slam doors. He didn't drop glasses. He didn't pace. For a woman whose nervous system was hardwired to react to the loud, chaotic stomping of an angry man, Roman's absolute stillness was a terrifying kind of peace. Her sanctuary was a small, windowless office near the back of the apartment. Inside, boxes of heavy leather-bound ledgers were stacked to the ceiling. Roman had been telling the truth. It was tedious work. Names, dates, amounts, all handwritten. None of the names were famous, and the amounts varied from mundane to staggering. Nora didn't ask questions. She didn't try to connect the dots. She sat at the heavy oak desk, her ankle propped up on a stool, and cross-referenced columns for 8 hours a day. It was mindless. It was safe. On the 6th afternoon, the quiet shattered. Nora was in the kitchen, carefully balancing her weight on her good foot while pouring a glass of water, when the private elevator chimed. Heavy, hurried footsteps echoed down the hallway. It wasn't Gideon. Gideon moved like a shadow. This man walked with heavy, aggressive purpose. Nora froze, the glass halfway to her mouth. Her heart executed a familiar, sick leap into her throat. Her brain immediately overrode her logic. Angry footsteps, heavy boots, fast pace. She backed into the corner of the kitchen, sliding into the shadow beside the massive refrigerator. She made herself as small as possible, her breathing shallow, her eyes fixed on the entrance to the living room. A man burst into the open space. He was younger than Roman, wearing a leather jacket, his face flushed red with fury. "It's a complete disaster," the man shouted, his voice echoing violently off the concrete ceiling. "The docks are locked down. They seized 3 containers, Roman. 3! Roman stepped out of his study. He held a glass of water, his expression completely blank. He looked at the screaming man the way one might look at a stain on a rug. "Keep your voice down, Silas," Roman said quietly. "Keep my voice down?" Silas paced aggressively, waving his arms. "We are bleeding money. The Italians are pushing back, and you're up here drinking water. We need to hit back. Tonight!" Silas turned, kicking a heavy leather ottoman in his frustration. The piece of furniture skidded across the floor with a loud, grating screech. In the kitchen, Nora flinched violently. The sound triggered a cascade of memories. Trent throwing chairs, smashing plates, screaming in her face. Before she could stop herself, a sharp, ragged gasp tore from her throat. She dropped the glass. It shattered on the marble floor with a sharp crack. The silence that followed was instant and suffocating. Silas stopped pacing. He snapped his head toward the kitchen. "Who the hell is that?" He started walking toward the shadows, reaching under his leather jacket. Nora pressed herself harder into the wall, her hands trembling, her chest heaving. She closed her eyes, bracing for the inevitable violence. "Stop!" Roman's voice didn't rise in volume, but it cut through the room like a physical blade. Silas froze in his tracks, inches from the kitchen entrance. "Step away from the kitchen, Silas," Roman ordered. The temperature in the room plummeted. Silas looked back at his boss, confusion warring with his anger. "Roman, you have someone lurking in the—" "I will not repeat myself," Roman said, stepping forward. He moved with a sudden, predatory grace, closing the distance between them in seconds. He stopped right in front of Silas, forcing the younger man to look up at him. "You come into my home. You raise your voice. You break my furniture. And now you reach for a weapon in the presence of my guest." "Guest?" Silas scoffed nervously, taking a half step back. "Look, I'm just stressed about the shipments. The Italians—" "I will handle the docks," Roman interrupted smoothly. "You will go back to the warehouse. You will sit quietly. And you will never, under any circumstances, raise your voice in this penthouse again. Do we have an understanding?" Silas swallowed hard. The furious bravado had completely evaporated, replaced by genuine, naked fear. Yes, Roman. Understood." "Get out." Silas didn't hesitate. He turned and practically ran for the elevator. The doors closed, sealing the noise away. Roman stood in the center of the living room for a long moment, simply breathing. Then he turned slowly and walked toward the kitchen. Nora was still pressed against the wall, staring at the shattered glass at her feet. She was shaking so hard her teeth rattled. She felt pathetic. She had survived Trent. She had survived the alley. And here she was, falling apart because some stranger yelled. Roman stopped at the edge of the kitchen. He looked at the broken glass, then up at Nora. He didn't step closer. He recognized a cornered animal when he saw one. He didn't ask if she was okay. He didn't offer a platitude. Instead, Roman reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He pressed a single button and held it to his ear. "Martha," Roman said quietly, his eyes never leaving Nora's pale face. "There is broken glass in the kitchen. Please handle it." He paused. "And contact the warehouse. Inform Silas that he is indefinitely suspended. If he returns to this building, Gideon is to break his legs." He hung up the phone. Nora looked up at him, her breath hitching. She expected him to be annoyed by her weakness, to tell her she was being hysterical. "He is gone," Roman said flatly. "Loud men are a liability. They lack control. I do not permit liabilities in my home." He wasn't comforting her. He was stating a policy. But in that cold, clinical statement, Nora found a strange, twisted comfort. Roman didn't coddle her trauma. He eradicated the source of it. He gave her one last, lingering look, his gray eyes catching the dim light of the kitchen. "Go back to work, Nora," he murmured, turning away. Nora watched him walk back to his study, the shadows swallowing him whole. She looked down at her hands. They had stopped shaking. She realized, with a sudden jolt of dark clarity, that she wasn't just working off a debt anymore. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. Winter hit the city like a swung hammer. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the skyline was swallowed by a relentless, bruised gray blizzard. The glass felt ice-cold to the touch, separating the freezing chaos of the world below from the suffocating, climate-controlled silence of the penthouse. Nora stood by the window, watching the snow bury the streets. Her ankle had healed weeks ago. The paper cut on her palm was now a thin, white crescent scar. Her uniform was gone, replaced entirely by garments Martha purchased. Heavy cashmere sweaters, tailored wool trousers, clothes that fit perfectly and lacked any branding. She looked like old money. She felt like a ghost. It had been exactly 2 months. 61 days of auditing handwritten ledgers in the windowless back office. 61 days of silent breakfasts with a man who ran a criminal empire from a laptop. She walked back to her desk. The final ledger lay open, its leather cover cracked and smelling of old dust. She ran her pen down the final column of numbers, checking the sum against her digitized spreadsheet. It matched to the penny. She closed the book. The heavy thud of the cover echoed in the small room. It was done. The backlog was cleared. Panic, cold and sharp seized the back of her neck. Survival had always been a transaction for Nora. She understood her value in this sterile, high-altitude bunker was directly tied to the work she produced. Roman Coyle did not keep pets. He did not harbor liabilities. If her utility had expired, what was her place here? She pushed her chair back, the wheels scraping against the hardwood floor. She needed to know. She couldn't stomach the anxiety of waiting for the axe to fall. She found Roman in his study. The room was dark, illuminated only by the harsh blue glow of multiple monitors. He sat perfectly straight, a headset resting around his neck, typing a line of code with a rhythmic, mechanical precision. Nora knocked once on the open door frame. Roman didn't flinch. He finished his keystrokes, hit enter, and slowly turned his chair to face her. His pale eyes caught the monitor light, making them look almost translucent. "The audit is complete," Nora said. Her voice was steady, betraying none of the frantic calculations running through her head. "All 82 ledgers have been digitized, cross-referenced, and encrypted on the local server." Roman looked at her for a long, silent moment. He didn't offer praise. He didn't smile. "I know," he said simply. "I reviewed your upload 10 minutes ago. Your error rate is 0. Nora crossed her arms, digging her fingers into the thick cashmere of her sleeves. "So, the transaction is complete." Roman leaned back. The leather chair creaked softly. "Are you asking for permission to leave, Nora?" "I'm asking what happens when a tool is no longer required." "Tools are discarded," Roman agreed, his voice a low, smooth baritone that offered zero comfort. "Or they are repurposed." Before Nora could ask what that meant, the penthouse shuddered. It wasn't a subtle vibration. It was a deep, structural jolt that rattled the heavy crystal decanters on the wet bar down the hall. A split second later, the power cut entirely. The monitors went black. The hum of the climate control died. The penthouse plunged into absolute suffocating darkness. Nora gasped, stumbling backward until her shoulders hit the doorframe. Her immediate instinct was to run, to find a small space, to hide. The old programming flared to life. Darkness meant vulnerability. "Do not move." Roman's voice wasn't a shout. It was a command laced with a terrifying calm. A red emergency light flared to life in the corner of the ceiling, casting the study in a bloody, low-visibility hue. Roman was already on his feet. He wasn't looking at a phone or a radio. He was looking at a small analog panel beneath his desk. A single light on it was blinking a frantic, violent amber. "The primary and secondary power grids have been severed," Roman stated, moving toward a hidden panel in the bookshelf. He pressed his thumb to a biometric scanner. The shelf clicked and slid open, revealing a wall of matte black steel. "The lobby elevator shafts have been locked down, but someone is in the service stairwell." "Gideon?" Nora asked, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "Gideon is in the basement garage. He is occupied." Roman pulled a heavy, suppressed handgun from the safe. He checked the magazine with a sharp, metallic snap, then chambered around. The sound was deafening in the quiet room. "They bypassed him." Nora's mind raced. "Who bypassed him?" Roman looked at her, his expression utterly devoid of fear. He looked mildly inconvenienced. "The Italians. They have been losing territory at the docks. They require leverage." "Why now? Why tonight?" "Because," Roman said, stepping out of the study and gesturing for her to follow. A mid-level shift manager with a broken hand and a bruised throat walked into one of their bars 3 days ago. He was very drunk, and he was very loud about the license plate of the car that took his girlfriend. Nora's blood turned to ice water. Trent hadn't let it go. His bruised ego had metastasized into something fatal. He didn't have the power to touch Roman, but he knew the people who did. He had traded her location to the highest bidder just to get even. "He sold you out," Nora whispered, the reality crashing down on her. "He gave them this address to get to me." "He gave them an entry point," Roman corrected. He grabbed her arm, not tight enough to bruise, but firm enough to guide her with absolute authority. "Come." He pulled her down the long, red-lit corridor toward the master suite. The penthouse, which had felt like a fortress for 2 months, suddenly felt like a beautifully designed tomb. The silence was no longer comforting. It was pregnant with impending violence. "Where are we going?" Nora asked, struggling to keep up with his long strides. "The panic room," Roman said. They reached the heavy oak doors of the master bedroom. Roman pushed them open. He walked past the massive bed and pressed his hand against a seemingly blank wall mirror. Nothing happened. Roman stopped. He pressed his hand against the glass again. He looked down at the floorboards, then up at the ceiling. A muscle in his jaw ticked. It was the first sign of genuine emotion she had ever seen him display. "They cut the hydraulic lines," Roman murmured, almost to himself. He turned to face her, his pale eyes catching the red emergency lights. "The vault is dead." A heavy metallic thud echoed from the front of the penthouse. Someone had just breached the service door. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate, and numerous. Nora backed away from the mirror, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She knew the sound of boots on hardwood. It was the soundtrack to her worst memories. But this wasn't one drunk, angry man. This was a tactical squad. "How many?" she whispered. "4. Perhaps 5, Roman said. He didn't look panicked. He looked calculating. He was mapping the angles of the room in his mind, calculating trajectories and blind spots. He moved away from the broken vault, grabbing Nora by the shoulder and pushing her toward the massive walk-in closet. "Get in," Roman ordered. "Go to the very back, behind the winter coats. Keep your head below the garment line. Do not make a sound, regardless of what you hear." "Roman, Nora!" His voice hardened, a sharp edge cutting through the panic clouding her brain. He leaned in, his face inches from hers. He smelled of cold air and gun oil. "I am going to kill the men in my hallway. You will stay here. If you step out, you become a variable. I do not have the margin for variables tonight. Do you understand?" Nora swallowed hard, looking into those pale, fractured gray eyes. There was no warmth in them, but there was a terrifying certainty. He was a monster, yes, but tonight, he was her monster. "I understand," she said. She stepped backward into the closet. Roman pulled the heavy wooden doors shut. The darkness inside the closet was absolute. Nora scrambled backward, her hands brushing against heavy wool and silk until her spine hit the back wall. She sank to the floor, pulling her knees tight to her chest, burying her face in her arms. She focused on her breathing. In, out, do not scream, do not move. Outside the closet, the silence stretched thin, taut as piano wire. Then, a voice echoed from the living room. It was thick with a heavy, mocking accent. "Mr. Coyle, a beautiful home. Pity about the lights." Roman didn't answer. "We want the girl, Roman. You took something that belongs to a friend of ours. Hand her over, and we walk out. A gesture of good faith between businessmen." Silence. "Sweep the rooms," the voice commanded, losing its mocking tone. The heavy footsteps began to move. Nora could hear the floorboards creaking down the hallway. They were checking the kitchen, the guest room, the study, getting closer. Thump, thump, thump. The footsteps entered the master bedroom. Nora clamped a hand over her own mouth. Her heart was beating so hard she felt it in her teeth. "Clear," a voice grunted from just outside the closet door. "Check the closet." A hand gripped the brass handle of the closet door. The mechanism clicked. Nora squeezed her eyes shut. This was it. She was going back to Trent. Or she was going to die right here on a pile of designer shoes. It wasn't a loud noise. It sounded like a heavy book dropping onto a thick carpet. A sharp, muffled cough of air. The handle of the closet door rattled violently, then released. A heavy weight slumped against the wood with a wet, meaty thud, sliding slowly to the floor. "Marco?" a voice barked from the hallway. Pfft, pfft. Two more muffled coughs. A heavy crash of glass shattering. One of the lamps on the nightstand. A choked, gurgling sound that lasted exactly 3 seconds before abruptly cutting off. "He's in the—" Gunfire erupted, but it wasn't the muffled, polite sound of Roman's suppressed weapon. It was the deafening, concussive roar of an unsilenced automatic rifle tearing the bedroom apart. Nora screamed against her hand as bullets ripped through the plaster walls, tearing into the closet. Wood splintered, silk shredded. The air filled with the sharp, acidic smell of cordite and pulverized drywall. She pressed herself flat against the floor, covering her head as debris rained down on her. The rifle fired for 5 endless seconds, a blind, panicked spray of bullets, then a single, suppressed response. Pfft! The rifle stopped. A heavy body hit the floorboards with a final, echoing crash. Silence descended on the apartment once again. It was a heavy, ringing silence, broken only by the soft, ragged sound of Nora's own breathing and the hiss of cold air blowing through a shattered window. Nora didn't move. She waited in the dark, her muscles locked in a state of tetany, her ears ringing from the concussive force of the rifle. Minutes ticked by, 5, 10. Then the closet door slowly pulled open. The red emergency light bled into the destroyed closet. Roman stood in the doorway. His suit jacket was gone. His white shirt was splattered with a stark, brutal pattern of crimson. He held the suppressed handgun pointed downward, his finger resting casually off the trigger. He didn't look breathless. He didn't look triumphant. He looked like a man who had just finished a tedious chore. "Are you injured?" Roman asked. His voice was exactly the same as it had been an hour ago, asking about the ledgers. Nora looked up at him, then down at her hands. She patted her chest, her legs. She was covered in drywall dust and shredded fabric, but there was no blood. "No," she croaked. "I'm okay." Roman nodded. "Come out." Nora scrambled to her feet, her knees shaking so badly she nearly fell. She stepped over the threshold of the closet. The master bedroom was a slaughterhouse. 3 men lay dead on the floor. The walls were chewed to pieces by gunfire, the expensive art shredded, the heavy curtains blowing wildly in the freezing wind from the shattered windows. The smell of copper and gunpowder was so thick it tasted metallic on her tongue. Nora stared at the bodies. She had spent years terrified of violence. She had cowered from it, ran from it, begged it to stop. But looking at the dead men at her feet, she realized something profound. Violence wasn't just a tool of oppression. In the hands of a man like Roman Coyle, it was an absolute shield. She wasn't afraid of the bodies. She was profoundly, deeply relieved they were dead. Roman was watching her face. He saw the shift. He saw the coldness settle over her features. "There is one more," Roman said softly. He turned and walked toward the living room. Nora followed him, her steps growing steadier with every yard. The living room was cast in deep shadows and the bloody glow of the emergency lights. In the center of the room, kneeling on the expensive Persian rug, was a fourth man. He wasn't wearing tactical gear. He wore a cheap rain-soaked jacket. His hands were zip-tied behind his back, and blood leaked from a deep gash on his forehead. It was Trent. He was trembling violently, his eyes wide, darting frantically around the destroyed penthouse. When he saw Roman step out of the shadows, covered in blood, Trent let out a pathetic, whimpering sob. "Please," Trent begged, his voice cracking, snot running down his upper lip. "I didn't know. They just asked where she was. They said they only wanted to talk to her. They forced me to come." Roman didn't acknowledge him. He walked over to the wet bar, picked up a heavy crystal glass that had survived the vibrations, and poured 3 fingers of scotch. He drank it neat, staring out the window at the blizzard. Nora stepped out of the hallway. Trent saw her. His eyes widened even further, a desperate feral hope sparking in his gaze. "Nora! Oh God, Nora, please!" Trent cried, struggling against his plastic restraints. Tell him I'm nobody. I was just drunk. I didn't mean any of this. I was just hurt that you left. You know me, Nora. You know I'm not a threat." Nora looked down at him. The man kneeling before her was the architect of 3 years of terror. He was the reason she flinched at loud noises, the reason she kept a go bag packed under her bed, the reason she had run barefoot through a hotel corridor. For 3 years, he had been a towering, terrifying giant in her mind. But looking at him now, bathed in red light and weeping on a stranger's rug, the illusion shattered. He wasn't a giant. He was a pathetic, small man who only felt big when he was breaking things smaller than himself. Beside the cold, terrifying reality of Roman Coyle, Trent was nothing but noise. "You brought a hit squad into my home, Trent," Nora said. Her voice didn't shake. It was dead flat. Trent blinked, thrown off by her tone. He expected her to cry. He expected her to cower. "I didn't bring them. They brought me. Nora, please, you have to save me. I love you." Nora felt a wave of absolute disgust roll through her stomach. "You don't know what love is," Nora said softly. "You just hate losing." Roman turned from the window. He set the empty glass down on the bar with a sharp click. He walked over and stopped beside Nora, looking down at Trent with the clinical detachment of a mortician. Roman pulled a hunting knife from the sheath on his belt. The blade caught the red light. Trent screamed, scrambling backward on his knees, thrashing wildly. "No, no, please!" Roman didn't stab him. He reversed the grip and offered the handle of the knife to Nora. Nora stared at the heavy black handle. "He is the final variable," Roman said, his voice a low hum. "He breached the perimeter. He brought chaos into my environment. By my laws, he dies." Roman's pale eyes locked onto hers. "But he is your ghost. You decide how this ends." It was a test. It was an initiation. Nora looked at the knife. She looked at Trent, who was sobbing hysterically, begging for his life, his face buried in the carpet. She could take the knife. She could end the nightmare right now with her own hands. She felt the urge, dark and heavy, pooling in her chest. A desire for vengeance. A desire to balance the scales for every bruise, every insult, every stolen dollar. She reached out. Trent squeezed his eyes shut and wailed. Nora's fingers brushed the handle of the knife. She paused. She didn't take it. She lowered her hand, stepping back. She looked up at Roman. "No," Nora said, her voice echoing clearly in the vast room. Roman's expression remained unreadable. "You show him mercy?" No, Nora replied, a cynical, cold smile touching the corner of her mouth. Mercy implies he matters. He doesn't matter. Killing him makes him a part of my story forever. It makes him significant. I refuse to give him that. Trent gasped for air, opening his eyes, a flood of relief washing over his pathetic face. Thank you. Oh God, Nora. Thank you. I don't want his blood on my hands, Nora continued, ignoring Trent completely, keeping her eyes locked on Roman. But he knows where we are, and he is a liability. Roman studied her face. He saw the cold calculation. He saw the final death of the terrified waitress and the birth of something entirely new, something that belonged in this penthouse. A slow, microscopic smirk finally touched the corner of Roman's mouth. He sheathed the knife. "Gideon," Roman said, speaking into the silence of the room. The heavy service doors opened. The giant bodyguard stepped into the living room. His suit was torn and his knuckles were bloody, but he looked completely unbothered. "Yes, Mr. Coyle," Gideon rumbled. "Mr. Miller is a liability," Roman instructed, without looking away from Nora. "Remove him from the premises. Ensure he never speaks of this address or this woman again." Gideon nodded once. He walked over to Trent, grabbed him by the collar of his cheap jacket, and lifted him off the floor with one hand. "Wait! What does that mean?" Trent panicked, thrashing as his feet left the ground. "She said she didn't want me dead. She spared me. Nora, tell him." Nora finally looked at Trent. Her gaze was entirely empty. "I said I didn't want your blood on my hands, Trent," Nora said softly. "I never said I cared what happened to you." Gideon dragged Trent toward the service elevator, ignoring the man's frantic screaming and kicking. The heavy steel doors parted. Gideon stepped inside, and the doors slammed shut, cutting off the noise instantly. The penthouse returned to its suffocating, engineered silence. Roman and Nora stood alone in the red-lit wreckage of the living room. The bodies in the hallway were a problem for later. The broken glass was a problem for later. Roman reached out, his long fingers gently brushing a streak of drywall dust from Nora's cheek. It was the softest touch she had ever received, executed by hands that had just taken 3 lives. "The audit is complete," Roman murmured, his thumb resting against her jawbone. "But I find I still require your services." Nora leaned into the touch, the coldness of his skin grounding her. She wasn't a captive anymore. She had walked through the fire and found the only man who could build a cage strong enough to keep the world out. "Good," Nora whispered, matching his cynical, steady gaze. "I hate looking for new work." Nora finally faced her darkest nightmare and walked away a completely different woman. She didn't just survive the Mafia boss. She proved she belongs in his world. Roman didn't offer her a fairy tale. He offered her absolute power and the coldest form of protection. Did you love that dark, grounded twist at the end? If you felt the chill of Roman's calculated violence and Nora's ultimate transformation, hit that like button. Share this story with anyone who craves a truly cynical mafia romance, and subscribe so you never miss another gripping, dark drama. What would you have done with the knife? Let me know in the comments.